All right, team, welcome to another episode of the Exceptional Leadership Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Matt Hamilton, excited to have your company from wherever you may be joining me from. In fact, there are a couple of really interesting locations that have popped up on the podcast analytics, and a bit of a shout out to everybody listening in Salt Lake City in the United States of America, Townsville and Brisbane in Queensland, New South Wales, Adelaide, Victoria, and of course Perth, where we are broadcasting from, and actually many other parts of the world as well. So thank you everybody for tuning in. It's very cool to see the reach of the show expanding. Now today we're going to have a discussion on the topic of critical thinking, and before we do get into it, I'll just call out the fact that my voice is a little croaky today. I do have a bit of a cold, so hopefully I'm not going to cough and splutter through this too much, but I appreciate you bearing with me. So yes, the topic today is critical thinking and just how important it is in the leadership ranks. But actually zooming out a little bit, not just the leadership ranks, it's also crucial just to be a functioning, healthy member of society in 2025, in my view. And that is because we live in a time where we have never had access to more information. If you think about all the different sources that we are bombarded with information from 24/7, all your social media, all your television news broadcasts, podcasts, everybody is coming at you with information, and you need to work out what the biases of that person might be that is feeding you that information and their reason for imparting that information onto you. It's a tricky thing to be able to do when you have so much of it coming from all angles. So we're going to get into why it's important to manage that and explore some tools to help us do so. But as we always do, let's get started with an example from recent history. Today we're going to go all the way back to 1982 and revisit the Tylenol crisis and have a look at how critical thinking saved Johnson & Johnson, the big pharmaceutical company, and indeed a lot of lives along the way. Here we go. In the fall of 1982, a chilling wave of panic swept across Chicago. 7 people had died suddenly, all within days of one another. The only link? Each had taken extra-strength Tylenol shortly before their death. At Johnson & Johnson headquarters, CEO James Burke received the call that would define his leadership. Tylenol, the company's most trusted and profitable product, appeared to be at the centre of a deadly mystery. Capsules had been tampered with, laced with cyanide in fact, and it wasn't clear how far the contamination had spread. The advice poured in quickly. Some urged caution, others suggested it was just an isolated incident, likely local. But many warned that a recall of the product would destroy the brand and cripple the company financially. Burke listened to these opinions, but he thought deeper. He gathered all available information, consulting with law enforcement, health officials, and his internal teams. He asked hard questions like, how widespread is the risk? What did the company truly owe the public? And what action would he want taken if his own family had bought a bottle of Tylenol? Rejecting the safer, slower corporate route, Burke made a bold decision, and that was to pull every bottle of Tylenol from every shelf across the United States. That translated to over 31 million bottles gone. A loss of more than $100 million, in fact. Then he went further. Johnson & Johnson pioneered tamper-evident packaging, foil seals, plastic bans and box warnings, changes that would later become industry standard and protect millions into the future. The public took notice. Far from losing trust, consumers praised the transparency, speed and integrity of the company's response. And within months, Tylenol returned to the shelves and, almost unbelievably, reclaimed its market dominance. Burke's critical thinking had transformed a tragedy into a masterclass in ethical leadership. He didn't just save a brand, he reset the bar for how leaders respond under pressure. And that's an example of how critical thinking is so valuable on a large scale. And indeed, you could say that the critical thinking there on the part of the CEO possibly did save lives. We certainly know that it protected the image of Johnson & Johnson as a company because they were shown to be taking quick and targeted action once all the information had been processed. That's a good example of critical thinking on a larger scale. But my initial thoughts on this topic when I was constructing the run sheet for this episode today is that I don't think humans are very good at thinking critically. It really is something that takes effort and introspection. And I say introspection because you have to be aware of your own bias when taking in information, not just the bias of the source or other people passing on that information to you. And that's really difficult to do, isn't it? To be introspective enough to realize that you might be more willing to accept a particular version of a story simply because of your own internal biases. So I don't think people are naturally very good at it, and it takes work. But as a leader, I think it's crucial because you'll regularly be presented with numerous perspectives on the same issue, much like the Johnson & Johnson CEO in our example was. And in some of those cases, particularly those that involve conflict, the information that's going to be fed to you may be part of a bigger agenda, something that really adds a layer of complexity to how you handle it. So in general, putting leadership aside for the moment, and as I briefly had a chat about in the introduction, we live in a world where we are just bombarded with constant information 24/7. Everything that we access on social media, when we turn on the TV, when we listen to a podcast, no matter where you access your information, somebody is feeding you a perspective. And it seems to vary heavily depending on the source that you get that information from, doesn't it? And often people will view the same actions, the same event, and it's interesting to observe that depending on their personal worldview or their bias, they will often have an opinion on it that's not necessarily objective, but is in accordance with their internal bias. And we are no different as leaders. We all, as individuals, have internal bias, and we need to be aware of it. Now, maybe the inability to think critically is acceptable, although I would say unfortunate, outside of leadership ranks, but absolutely inexcusable within them. Leaders, in my view, must be excellent critical thinkers to do the job well. And I suspect that some of us have forgotten what that looks like. And that's not meant to be a scathing criticism. It's just meant to be an observation that it's difficult and it's a skill that has to be maintained because we are all emotional beings. And emotion, as we know, clouds judgment. So let's get specific as to what I mean by critical thinking. What skills and techniques should we be implementing to make sure that we stay the course? So in a nutshell, it's the ability to think clearly, rationally, and independently, to analyze information and make judgments. That's what it is. But we can break that down further into parts, which I think is helpful. So we have the analysis phase. When you receive the information, breaking it down, especially when it's complex, and sorting it into parts. Then we'll conduct some evaluation on those parts. We want to assess arguments and the evidence for the validity and reliability of those, keeping in mind the bias of the information sources. And that could be organizations or people. Then we've got inference, which is how we draw logical conclusions from the available information. What do we infer from the information that we've consumed? And how do we get to that place? Then we have a critical component as leaders, which is the explanation. So once we've arrived at our inference, we're going to clearly communicate reasonably and with good, clear thought processes, You need to be able to articulate clearly why you've arrived at a conclusion. And if you can't do that, it's probably an indication that you haven't done enough work from a critical thinking perspective. You need to be able to articulate it logically and clearly. Then we have another critical part of critical thinking, which is the ability to self-regulate. We need to reflect on our own thinking and be open to correction. That is massive as a leader. You must have the ability to change your mind when presented with better information. And this includes the recognition of our own bias, possibly one of the hardest parts of this process. So that's what our steps look like that comprise good quality critical thinking. And that is what we should be striving for. Now, as I said at the top of the episode, this has value for all of us, not just leaders. Helps us function in society. Gives us, I would say, an inner confidence if we know that we have the ability to process information effectively, question both sides, and arrive at what is likely a logical conclusion. And we can see it really from, high school all the way through to professional working life, can't we? The value of critical thinking. In high school or even in the workplace, let's face it, you will have rumours doing the rounds. And often people accept the content of those rumours without question. It's rare that you'll have someone stand up and question the content. But the acceptance of rumours is an example of lazy thinking. All right, so we're outside the leadership realm right now. We're exploring how it is valuable to think critically, just in society in general. And the question that I would ask you is, how would you want people to think and behave if they were presented with information about you? Let's say it's not a flattering assessment of your ability or your skills or your conduct. And maybe it's completely untrue because somebody has malicious intent. That does happen, unfortunately, and you will come across this as a leader if you have a disgruntled staff member or someone who is looking to perhaps get you out of a job. It does happen. It's unfortunate, but it's a reality. And what I would want is these people who are hearing these rumours and being fed this information to have excellent critical thinking skills. I would want them to remember that there are two sides to every story. That's a part of critical thinking. I'd want them to go through those 5 steps that we just discussed. I want them to analyse the information. I want them to evaluate the arguments being presented and make sure that they consider the potential biases of the source who is providing them with that information, i.e., what is this person's motive? Why are they giving me this information? What might be in it for them? Then I want them to infer logical conclusions after performing those steps. Now, they don't need to have an explanation because they're not in a leadership position. So they can skip that 4th step, but they do need to then be able to self-regulate because they obviously will formulate a opinion which will translate to an attitude towards the subject of that gossip and those rumours. So they need to reflect on their own thinking and how they've processed that information and perhaps consider their own bias. And let's delve into that a little bit more. Maybe you're in a position where, as a leader, you have had someone come to you and talk ill of a colleague. So we're flipping it now. First, we explored the scenario whereby perhaps a non-leader is being told a rumour. And now we're exploring the other side, where you are in leadership, and perhaps a colleague, maybe a fellow manager, is feeding you information about an employee or a fellow manager, whatever the situation may be. And what I'd encourage you to do is all of those steps that we elaborated on, but to distill it even further and ask yourself, well, what has my experience with this person been? And how does that marry up with what this other person is saying? Because if someone comes to you and says, look, John is a difficult person, he does this, that, and the other, seems to have a bad attitude, but your dealings with that person have been nothing other than positive, and you've seen the way that he interacts with other people, and that also seems to be nothing but polite positivity, then that should cause you to question a little more the motives behind the source that is providing you with that information. And the subsequent result of that means you are not going to be forming an inaccurate opinion of someone and their abilities. Very important. Maybe you have, and I am labouring the point because this is crucial as a leader, so I want to do this thoroughly. Maybe you have a scenario where you have two employees in your team that just don't like each other. And it's obvious. They don't try and hide it. And you can bet that they're both going to feed you information about the other, or express opinions to you about the other. And now you're in a real difficult position because you have to assess what is real and what's not. You have to assess how much of the information being fed to you is true and how much of it might be exaggerated or a part of a broader campaign to achieve a goal. Some people are a little more crafty than others when it comes to this sort of thing. So you can see there's many usage cases for critical thinking, and that's why I say it's not just a leadership thing, it's just a community thing. Everybody really does benefit from having great skills in this area. But as a leader, it's crucial, even more so, because not only does it mean we adopt the right course of action, but it ensures the safety of our people. Now, I don't think safety is an overly dramatized conclusion to come to. I do think that the ability to think clearly means you're able to ensure the safety of your people, because it means that when gossip starts, when vicious and nasty rumours do the rounds, as they do sometimes about a person, it means you're going to be able to come to the right conclusion and take the right steps in regard to that person to protect them, to put the right version of the story out there, and to treat them as they should be treated. We talk a lot about psychosocial risks in the workplace these days. Make no mistake, there's not so much physical bullying anymore in the workplace, but there is plenty of that covert, passive-aggressive bullying that goes on. In fact, I'd suggest to you that it's quite prevalent. And some people are quite malicious in the way that they go about it. So let's just be aware of that as leaders. Let's be aware that bullying is alive and well, and that those psychosocial risks that go hand in hand with action of that kind are very real, and as leaders we are responsible for dealing with it effectively. And a part of being able to do that is to process information really, really well. So friends, make sure you work on your critical thinking, and we will leave it there. All right, guys, as I always do, very important. Please make sure you subscribe to the show on whatever podcast app you consume it on. The other thing that I'd encourage you to do is subscribe to the show on Instagram. The Instagram handle is exceptional_leadership_podcast. It was the best one I could get. But I am trying hard to put out a few more reels and make it a little bit more entertaining while also maintaining that value. So I really would like to boost those numbers of followers on that account. And so I'd be very appreciative if you would navigate to Instagram. We're also on Facebook, so feel free to do it on there as well. But Instagram is the main one. So navigate to that page and hit follow. And I'm going to do my best to give you some informative but possibly more entertaining content on that platform as well. And finally, guys, if you're getting value from the show, please tell a friend, tell 10 friends, really trying to grow the show as much as possible. And together, maybe we can boost the standard of leadership globally. Until next time, I'll see you later.